Well, welcome everyone, and thank you so much for having me and my partner in crime, Kelly, tonight. Believe it or not, we did not originally realize that we were on the ballot at the same time. And I unfortunately have to go first. You're in for a treat when we get to her session. But let me tell you what I'm going to talk about first. My name is Heather Schoch. I'm the president and CEO of the Tennessee Center for Performance Excellence. That's TNCPE for short, and probably the only way you know any of us. We are a nonprofit here in Nashville. We serve the entire state of Tennessee, and we're here just to help organizations be excellent, not just good, not just great. We want to be excellent. We do that using the Baldrige criteria. We have a partnership with several ASQ chapters throughout the state, and I will say hands down, you all are the most active. We love coming to see you all because there's always a good program. We always meet some really great people. There are several on tonight who have been examiners as part of our program, and I think I even see a past conference speaker or two. So we really do appreciate the level of engagement that we have. In our line of work, Kelly and I focus more on big Q quality. I know that's an older term, but y'all seem like you're probably familiar. So whereas a lot of times we think about applying quality principles to our operational processes, Kelly and I are focused on bringing that same level of discipline up a few levels to the more administrative processes. So we get to think about things like how to build a culture of quality in your leadership system, or how to design your strategic plan with quality in mind, or how to talk to your customers about quality, are some of the things that we enjoy doing. But what I really wanted to focus on tonight, I chose this topic not just because I love data and charts like all of you. You are my people, and I know we all love data and charts. I really wanted to focus more on what are our managers and leaders' responsibility for data. It might not be the same as if you're the quality engineer, but when do they have a responsibility to use data, and what should it look like? So that's where we're headed for the evening. I love an interactive audience, so please drop questions in the chat, unmute, talk to me. I'm going to try to make you answer questions just so we can keep everybody awake for the hour that we have together. So with that being said, here we go. I'd like for you to take a minute, this is a pop quiz, and think about in which of these instances that I've described, things that might happen in your day-to-day business, do you think the use of data and information would be important? And here are your choices. Would you need to use data and information to decide whether or not to fire an employee? Would you need to use data and information as you're deciding which new markets to enter? Would you want to look at data and information to determine what level of employee engagement you have in your organization? To reduce the level of scrap metal in your plant, those of you from manufacturing, to improve your purchasing process, or to meet important customer metrics? What do y'all think? When would it be most important? Ha ha ha, Arvid says all. Maybe you've seen this class before, Arvid. Anybody disagree with that statement? Well, I got it right because it's a trick question. The answer is in every single one of those instances, you would need some sort of data and information, because as responsible managers and leaders, we're not supposed to make gut reactions, right? We're not supposed to go this way and that way based on nothing. So to follow that up, this is another trick question. Can you give me an example of a business decision you might want to make where looking for data and information would not be useful? Anybody got one? Struggled to think of one myself. The two that came to my mind were perhaps in an emergency. If the fire alarm's going, you run out of the building, right? You don't wait and make a plan. Or perhaps I couldn't really come up with a business situation, but maybe in your personal life, a decision where it really is down to personal preference. Do you want the blue shirt or the green shirt? At that point, we're probably not using data and information. But otherwise, as responsible citizens of the world who work in businesses that do well, we are not called upon to come in and share our opinions. We're called upon to use data and information to make good business decisions. And that's what we're going to talk about tonight. So we're going to begin with why using data and information is so important. Then we're going to talk a little bit about how you should select what level of data and information, depending on the decision and who you're going to talk to. And then at the end of the night, we're going to spend a little bit of time on data visualization, which is one of my favorite topics, but not what you asked me to present on. So we won't spend too much time there. Anybody have questions about our agenda? All right. In that case, I don't know if there are any Simon Sinek fans out there, but let's start with why, because that's important, and then we'll get into the how in a little bit. Why should we use data and information to make good business decisions? I shared during my introduction that I lead an organization called TNCPE, the Tennessee Center for Performance Excellence. We are the state version of the National Malcolm Baldrige Program, which is our nation's standard for excellence. If you've ever heard of the National Institute of Standards and Technology, many of you are engineers, that is where the Baldrige program is housed. So if you go there, you can see the standard inch and the standard yard, the standard pound, and you can find the Baldrige book there, which is the standard for what an excellent organization looks like. The way they develop that standard is they look across the United States at the businesses that are the most resilient, have the longest term sustainability and the best results, and they figure out what they all have in common. And if you look in the middle of this very busy graphic, this wheel that's kind of going around the circle that says systems perspective, those are the core values of the Baldrige criteria, what they believe are the attributes of our nation's best organizations. And right there, kind of to the left of the middle, one of them says management by fact. So one of the main reasons that I think it's important for us to discuss this topic is if you want to be excellent, not just good or great, you've got to figure out how to do this well. I do think it's interesting. It doesn't say make database decisions. It says manage by fact, because sometimes facts can be information that are not quantifiable, right? Not always data or bits, but we do want to use data and information to make our decisions. And the way the Baldrige criteria leads us to do that is to ask a series of questions about how you use data and information in all of these different phases and aspects of your business. So there's a whole section on how does your organization use data and information for strategic planning? And how frightening if you don't, right? How do you use data and information to identify who your customer segments are or who they might be in the future? Now we're talking about projections, right? Market analyses. How you use data and information to support operational decision-making. That's what I was talking about earlier, right? It's not, oh, I'm the manager and I'd like to do this. It's no, the data are telling us this is a good decision to make. The Baldrige criteria ask us how you use data and information to review your organization's performance and capabilities. This isn't personal or individual performance. This is your key process indicators and how well you're doing and what capability you have in your staff or if you're maxed out. How do you use data and information to develop priorities for continuous improvement and identify opportunities to innovate? I am baffled. Almost every organization I goes into have a great continuous improvement program. But when I ask them how they know what they want to improve or where they're going to use these continuous improvement principles, like, oh, just felt like we should do a project here. But that's another really important place to use data and information. You should also use it to assess your workforce capability and capacity needs. So do we need more engineers or do we need more administrative workers? And to ensure that your work processes are meeting process requirements. You all are the kings of making processes meet process requirements. So I'm not going to explain that one to you. Another reason that I think this idea of management by fact or database decision-making is so important is that objectivity, which is what we should be striving for in our business decisions, helps fight bias. And I know none of us think we're biased, especially this group of people who already love data and already love processes, but believe it or not, we are. In fact, there was a recent study done, if any of you have read the book, Thinking Fast and Slow, it's a fascinating book, says that your brain receives about 11 million pieces of information at any one time. And our brains are designed to be very effective and efficient, so they don't actually process all of them. Our brain behind the scenes, without us knowing that it's even happening, screens out the unimportant pieces of data and information and narrows it down to a subset of about 40 or 50 things that it can absorb and process in that moment, which means we're not taking in every detail at every moment. Unfortunately, that's also where our bias comes from, because sometimes our brain has built a pathway that it thinks is right. I know what this is. And sometimes it's a little bit incorrect. So that's where this idea of objectivity becomes so important. Sometimes we think we know, but we don't, because we're not using that data and information. We've already accidentally screened it out. Some examples of bias that I can share that you might encounter in the decisions that you make on a daily basis for your business. One would be stereotype bias. that is exactly what you think it is, right? Your brain sees the pattern. Hey, I've seen this before. I know what this is. I know what this group does. I know what an engineer is. I know what this process is. And it makes an assumption that may or may not be true. Another example of bias that you may encounter is that first impression bias. This one's fascinating to me. I was in a workshop recently where they showed two groups of people a different photo. And based on the photo, they asked them to guess some number. It was like, how many automobiles are in Taiwan? But one of them showed a very rural area where there were no automobiles, and one of them showed a bustling downtown. What do you think was the difference in the two groups' answers? Based on that first impression and literally no other information about Taiwan. You could have Googled it. They didn't. They just made a guess. That's your first impression bias. Oh, it looks rural. I bet I know the answer. Maybe check that. Maybe we need to be a little bit more objective. Another bias that you might encounter would be confirmation bias. Confirmation bias, I think sometimes we're all guilty of. It's when you think you know the answer, and so you seek out the data to support it. So if we don't frame our search for data and information in an objective way, you're going to get exactly what you go looking for. And I think we see that play out fairly frequently. One more that I'd like to mention, actually two more, I guess, the halo or the horns bias. This is, maybe there's somebody who's a top performer at work, the golden child, everybody loves what he or she has to say. And she makes a suggestion or says that something is right. And we all just go along with it because she's never wrong, right? Or unfortunately, the opposite is true. Somebody who maybe is on a performance improvement plan, somebody who screwed something up last week has a suggestion or idea, and we're very quick to dismiss it. We're like, nah, we don't want to listen to what you have to say. Again, this could be prevented if we were to look for data and information. And last but not least, the hindsight bias. This is one I think, particularly in recent times, that we're all guilty of. We are often called upon to make decisions with a limited data set or a limited amount of information. Light years down the road, past that decision, more data and information becomes available. And then we say, oh, we should have known, when indeed we couldn't have. There are many, many other types of biases, and I'm not here to share them all with you. But if you're ever bored, you could go Google some of these. I think they're interesting. IKEA bias is kind of fun. It's if you build it yourself, you think it's better than if you didn't. Fundamental attribution error is the idea that we all think we're walking around where everyone else has character flaws, but we don't. We just are put in crazy situations, and that's why we make mistakes. So if you have free time after tonight's presentation, go learn about some of these others. One more sort of groundwork I'd like to lay before we get into the heart of what we want to talk about is this idea of how are information and data different. So not to sound like a wedding speaker, but Merriam-Webster's defines information as knowledge obtained from investigation, study, or instruction, intelligence, news, facts, and data. So we see right away that data is one subset of information. I tend to think about it as information is any new knowledge that you've acquired from any reputable source, whereas data is more likely to be able to be digitized, to be able to be quantified, to be able to be expressed in some sort of number or chart. So that's how I'm going to use these terms for the rest of today's presentation. Okay, the next thing I want to be sure that we have a handle on is when we talk Baldrige and when we talk process engineering, which I think a lot of you do, I'm not asking you which or what data you are using. I'm asking you how you are making a decision to use data and go find it. And then only after that, which data you should be seeking. So we're really looking for a process to identify the data that should be an important part of running our business. And so to do that, I want to talk specifically about a model for making decisions to make sure that we get to data at the right point in our decision-making model. Another thing you can Google if you're ever in the mood just for a good laugh, Google decision-making process, because there's a million of them. And some of them have 3 steps, and some of them have 7 steps, and some of them have 11 steps. Kelly and I see some of this in some Baldrige applications sometimes. You say, how do you do blah, blah, blah? And they say, well, we identify what we want to do, and then we get the information, and then we make a really good decision based on it. And of course, everybody does that. It's not quite that simple. But just to help sort of scope what I want to talk about tonight, if you look at this very vague and generic decision-making process that I found on Google, I really just want to talk about steps 1 and 2. which is if we identify the correct problem, and if we frame that question for that problem the correct way, that will tell us what data and information to go get. And then we're going to talk about ways to go and get it and ways to use it once you have it. I personally believe, I'm a big begin with the end in mind person. If we set this up correctly at the beginning, the rest of the dominoes are just going to fall. We don't even have to worry about it anymore. So what we're going to cover: framing your problem statement or your question, then finding the correct data or information that's going to help you answer it, and then formatting that evidence in a way that removes the bias and is understandable by people who maybe don't look at regression analyses on a daily basis. So step one, we've got to frame the correct question. This to me is everything. You get this right, it's all going to go well. You get this wrong, you may as well throw the rest of it out the door because we've already messed it up. When we frame a question or a problem statement, we want to ask ourselves, what is the problem we are trying to solve? And before we assume we know the answer or what data are going to tell us, what would be the best criteria to use to solve that problem or to make that decision? You want to give yourself some sort of time frame or frequency, obviously based on how big or small this decision is. You're going to think about how long you have to make a good decision, or how long before the decision that you make is completely obsolete. And then finally, what do you want the data to tell you? And I don't mean the answer. I mean, at what point in this question are you ready to consult the data to see what's out there? Any questions about that? All right, so let's look at an example. I had this experience. I'm not going to say recently because Kelly and I are the only two people in the TNCPE office, but I had this experience in a different job where I had an employee who just loved to knock on my door all the time with emergencies that weren't really emergencies and demanded a ton of my time, and it drove me absolutely up the wall. One day I just absolutely had it, and I turned to a friend and I said, do I need to let this person go? Like, I'm not sure I can handle this. He is driving me crazy. Is that a good problem statement? Is that a good way to frame the question of the decision that I needed to make in that moment? It is not. It's got all kinds of bias in it, right? Anybody see any of the biases that we were talking about a little bit earlier there? I think this could definitely be a horns bias situation where it's somebody I already don't like. Or maybe even a confirmation bias. I want to fire him. I'm going to go look for something that's going to let me do it. And neither of those are the correct way to approach this problem statement. Instead, an objective way to frame that question that would then tell me what data and information I needed to go find might be, how has this employee performed against his stated objectives over the last 12 months? So I know what data I'm looking for, and I know over what period of time. Okay, anybody have an idea where I might be able to find that? Where would you find data and information on employee performance over the last 12 months? Any? Yeah, performance evaluations. Thank you, Ricardo. Absolutely. I think that's the first thing I have on my next slide. We're gonna see the answer to that one in just a minute. Anybody else ideas for where we might find that data or information? All right, well, I've got another one. I forgot I had another one. So be ready this time. I did have this experience fairly recently. I was on a consulting assignment in a manufacturing organization, and you never want to see this, right? I walked into the factory, and the first thing I saw was the hugest pile of scrap I think I've ever seen in my life. And I immediately thought, they're scrapping way too much wood. This can't be great. This is the hugest scrap pile of wood I have ever seen. Did I have any information on which to base that? Was that even a really valid thought for me to have? I can't help that I had it, but I immediately have to check it with some objectivity, right? I would have done so much better to have asked the person there, how much wood do you scrap on average each month as a percentage of your operating budget? So we have a very objective question that's framed, that's time bound, that's going to give me some data that I can use to compare to others. Maybe it's teeny for this industry. Maybe it's just a bad day, and I don't know any of that as I stand there staring at that pile of scrap. I could also ask them or myself, how profitable is this manufacturing line? How much money do we make per item after waste? Maybe it's a ton of scrap, and also they don't need to care about it. Maybe it's not relevant for what they're doing. So all of these things need to factor into the data and information that I'm going to go seeking as a way to solve this problem or make this decision. Okay, type it if you know it into the chat, or if you're really brave, you can come off mute. Another time that you might want to use data and information to make a decision. Let's say you have a supplier that isn't calling you back. That's not good, especially if there's something that you need pretty quickly. And so the thought you immediately have is, maybe I should just ditch the supplier and find somebody else. This one is not responsive enough. Not a very objective problem statement, no way to use data and information. Instead, you could ask yourself one of these two things. You could say, how do other suppliers compare on price and speed of customer service for this similar thing? Or objectively, what percentage of my calls have not been returned within 24 hours over the last 3 months? Can y'all think of any other objective data-based question you could ask yourself about whether or not you need to make a switch on suppliers? What might be another important criteria? On-time delivery, yes, on-time delivery, right? That's a big one. Absolutely. Thank you, John. Anybody else have one? Is it my fault? Yeah, absolutely. Quality of the product. Maybe they never call you back, but they're the only one that can make it at all. Maybe they are the only one that makes it really well. Fantastic. So the point is, we want to give ourselves not infinite opportunities to include data and information in our decisions, because then we'll never make the decision, and that's a problem. But we want to include the right amount of data and information for how important and time-bound the decision is. And switching suppliers, if it's a key supplier, if this is 3M we're talking about, not something you should undertake lightly, right? How have they performed against their scorecard? And again, all of the above. Those would all be better questions than, I'm so frustrated, you won't call me back. Maybe I should just get a new one. Which, hey, we've all thought it, but we don't actually do it. All right, one more. Should we expand our service to a new group of customers? I see this one a lot when I visit local power companies. Every local power company is trying to decide what other things to offer. Do they want to offer broadband? Do they want to offer fiber? Other ways to engage their sort of core customers that they've always had for electric. So they want to do it because they want to make more money. But what's a better question they could ask themselves? Maybe it's, how many new customers are likely to purchase our service over whoever the competition is at our current level of performance? Wow, we got lots of good qualifying words there to start to narrow down our data set, right? And we're giving ourselves the ability to make some projections, because I do want to point out, you don't always have the data that you need. Sometimes you have to create it and sometimes you have to project it, but we can still do that based on other data and information. Or another question we could ask ourselves is, how many new customers can our current service support and still be profitable? Maybe we're not even ready to open those floodgates yet because we don't have the workforce capability or capacity to service whatever this new product is. So all things that we need to be thinking about using data and information. So let's stop there for a minute. Any questions about sort of framing the question in such a way that's going to tell you what data you need to go find? Good. The trick, of course, is doing this upstream, right? When you're talking to your executive leader and trying to persuade them, they need to go listen to some data and information. But let's assume for just a moment you've got a great problem statement. You've framed a question, you've got the bias out of it, at least as much as we possibly can. You've set up some objective criteria that are time-bound, that are going to lead you to make a good, solid data-based decision. The next thing we got to do is we got to go find the data. And unfortunately, we don't always have it. So the questions that we have to ask ourselves are, where could I go find the data or information to answer this glorious problem statement that I've got, or this question that I have framed? How much data do you need? And that one's really important to think about. How important is the decision? How time-bound is the decision? You may not have time. I think sometimes as quality engineers or accountants are guilty of this too. We want 100% of the data before we decide. And sometimes that's not the best decision. Sometimes we need to get 60% or 80% of the data, and that's when it's time to move. So sort of getting that through your mind is, how much time do I have to go look for data, and how much am I going to capture? Is the juice worth the squeeze for this particular decision? If no data exists, can you create some? And is this an important enough decision that you should go create some data? And then what about comparative data? Baldrige says, yay, comparative data, but is it appropriate in every circumstance? So those are some of the things we're going to look at in this portion of the presentation. So let's go back to my original example. Should I fire the employee who is forever knocking on my office door with an emergency that isn't really an emergency and taking all of my time? We reframed the question to say, how has this employee performed against his objectives over the last 12 months? And then I asked the group what sort of data or information would be relevant. And thank you, I think it was Ricardo. Somebody responded and said performance evaluations. Before I go on to the next slide, does anybody have other places we might look for relevant data or information for this particular scenario? All right, seeing none, I too identified performance evaluations as a place that we might want to go look. So if we've set ourselves the time-bound question of how they performed over the past year, we might go pull 4 quarterly performance reviews and see what I wrote about this person. Maybe I'm just having a real bad day, or he is. But as we look over the year, there's really not that much that we're concerned about. Or perhaps as we look back, this employee has been coached on time management or only elevating certain things to management's intention. And we won't know that if we don't go back to the record and look. Another thing we might consider is whether or not that employee is on a performance improvement plan. Has this issue already been documented? And if so, what coaching was given? How has the person responded to the coaching? I say all of this to say there are various places you might look for data and information. And also in this particular scenario where we're talking about an HR issue, it may be just information. It may not be data. We may not be able to find a beautiful chart that answers the question. But even taking the step to go do this level of research, we're going to make an objective decision, a factual decision, as opposed to sort of that initial, oh, I'm so annoyed bias, where that would lead us. Okay, what about the next example? We were going to look at whether or not this manufacturing organization I got to see was scrapping too much wood because of the big mountain in front of the heat press. Looked pretty big to me. I need a way to quantify whether or not that's an appropriate amount of scrap or whether I should be concerned. And so some of the questions that I came up with that I might ask myself to reframe this decision to be more objective would be, how much wood does this organization scrap on average a month? There's my time bound. And what percentage is it of their operating budget? So where might I go look for that? Financial records would be fantastic. Imagine a lot of you have some Pareto analyses hanging up around your factories or workspaces. So here we've got the root causes of the various scrap and the value of each pile. And that's some pretty great information to give me a sense for if I should be concerned about the scrap pile or not. What's it coming from? How much is it worth? And then we're going to go grab Ricardo's financial records and we're going to have an actual factual management decision, as opposed to just my knee-jerk reaction of, wow, that looks like a lot of wood. Where'd that come from? All right, here's another example. You all are up in PALS territory. I love it when I get to talk to people who have been to a PALS. We don't have them here in Nashville, but I think you're all probably aware that PALS and Eastman are both former Baldrige Award winners. And one thing PALS ran into when they were kind of on this big Q quality journey with Baldrige, they were told they had to have comparative data, and they really struggled to find it. One of the questions they were trying to answer is, how does their drive-through time and accuracy rate compare to our top 3 competitors? Now, you all know who PALS is. Who do you think are their top competitors up there in your corner of Tennessee? What do you think? If y'all don't go get a burger or a milkshake at PALS, yes, the Golden Arches, absolutely. Anybody else? A likely competitor for PALS? Chick-fil-A, that's the big one here in Nashville for sure. Burger King, absolutely. I say all of this to say they could not get those organizations, Wendy's. This is exactly who they asked. They said, hey, would you like to share data? Would you like to form a collaborative and share data so that we can all get better? And every one of those organizations, particularly the one with the Golden Arches, said, nope, we don't want to do that. So when data can't be found, sometimes we have to create it. honest to goodness, several of the PALS employees were told on your way home from work once a week or whatever the time frame was, go through one of these other drive-thrus. Go get yourself a burger at McDonald's, go get yourself a milkshake at Wendy's or a Frosty. And when you do, start the timer when you pull into the drive-thru, stop the timer when you're handed your bag, and make a note of what the time was and if what's in the bag was correct. And over a very short period of time, they were able to create data, objective data, by which they could judge their own performance. Personally, I think that's fascinating and exciting. Maybe you all don't agree. Customer surveys, absolutely, found on receipts might be another way. So sometimes we have the data readily available. Sometimes we don't have anything quantifiable, but we can at least get information, which is better than nothing. Sometimes, in the case of PALS, we have to go create the data. But if you have determined through framing your question and sort of that first step in your problem-solving process that data is going to be important, you got to go find some somehow, right? So the final thing that we then need to think about is, now we've gathered all this data. How many of you think it would be a fantastic idea to show your executive leader all of this data in Minitab? Anybody think that's a good plan? I do not recommend that. Some of us live in a world, Kelly more so than me, she's an ASQ member and a black belt like many of you, where the more data, the merrier, and we can make sense of it. We have tools at our disposal and we know how to use them. A lot of people don't. And a lot of people often includes your senior leaders, right? They may not be prepared to see that level of data with that level of analysis. So the last thing we have to do is we frame the question, we've gotten the data. Now we almost have to frame or visualize the answer in a way that people can understand it or see it. And sometimes that's a chart, which I dearly love. And sometimes it's not, and that's okay. So let's talk about that for just 1 minute. Very important caveat here. This is fictitious data. I've made it up. These are not TNCPE's real numbers. But I'd like to show you the same fictitious TNCPE results presented 4 different ways. And I'd like for you to think about which one is the most effective based on the question we're trying to answer. So option number 1 right here shows how many organizations applied for TNCPE awards, fictitiously, from 2015 to 2020. And it has that broken down by part of the state, East, Middle, and West. What might have been the question I was trying to answer if I chose to display my data this way? When would this visualization distribution of data be the right one to show? What do y'all think? How many applicants are applying in each region? Changes over time. Fantastic. Maybe I'm asking myself which ASQ chapter needs a visit, right? Where am I not getting a lot of applicants? Another thing, I want you to look at the key at the bottom, the East, Middle, and the West. How could this chart be improved right off the bat so that it makes a little bit more sense to somebody that's not used to looking at charts? Anybody see it? West, Middle, East. It's just crazy to me. Our brains don't work that way because we're going to read the key and we're going to figure it out and we're already looking for the trend line. But come on, right? If you're your average senior leader who's never had a statistics class, put West, Middle, East, because that's what their brain's going to think. Oh, I know what that is. Why is it going the wrong direction? So the way in which you display the data can often, on purpose or by accident, influence what decision gets made. You could very easily misread this chart, right? And say, man, what's going on in the West as opposed to what's going on in the East. Very good. All right, exact same data set, distributed this way, or displayed, I should say, not distributed. Okay. Are missing bars true zeros? Yes, that's a fantastic question because I didn't tell you. You can see it on this chart. You couldn't on the other one. So same set of data. And this time I've got a line chart showing changes over time for those 3 regions. What might have been the question I was trying to answer with this chart? exact same numbers. Trends, absolutely. Yes, thank you, Dave. And I was thinking that when Duke wrote that earlier, you absolutely could see changes over time on the prior chart, but it's harder to find. Right here, that's pretty much what your eyes directly go to is, whoa, look at that dark blue bar that goes from 6 to 0. What happened there? So when we're looking for over time, sometimes this sort of line chart is a better way to show it than those segmented bars that I showed you on the last one. Keep in mind, these are all charts made in Excel. We're not even getting into anything, no scatter plots, nothing fancy here. Real simple charts that can help people visualize what the data are telling them. All right, I got two more, believe it or not, on the same data set. The stacked bar chart. What might this chart be trying to answer? What would be the advantage to displaying my data this way instead? Anybody guess what might have been my motivation to stack the bars? Proportion, fantastic. Now we're seeing percentages. We've got like individual pie charts in each bar. In this instance, what I was at the total. Yeah, exactly, Scott. What I was actually trying to do is project revenue by applicants. And it turns out they come from different places, but I can get a fairly good read on about how much money I'm going to get from applicants. Again, fictitious applicants, but that might be the reason to stack it like this. And you can still see those trends, right? That dark blue bar is getting smaller and the light blue bar is hopping all over the place. And the gray bar is fairly consistent, kind of just at different stacks on the chart, but it's about the same height each time. Fantastic from Arvid. I got yelled at the last time I gave this presentation for this, and as a cycle of improvement, I did nothing about it, so I apologize. Don't forget some of your audience are colorblind. Not only colorblind, it's never a good idea to be shades of blue as a chart, so bad on me. Another very important aspect of data visualization is choosing the right colors, and there are studies out there on that. Even in, again, if you're using like Excel or Minitab, it will tell you which resolution is better for people who maybe struggle with seeing. So that's definitely something important to keep in mind. And I appreciate you saying that, Arvid. All right, one more. Same data set again. The pie chart that we always think is good for nothing. What is this chart telling us? What question might I have been trying to answer about my applicant pool with this? What did I lose might be another question by going with the pie chart instead of something a little bit more dynamic. What can we not see anymore? Yeah, no trends at all. We don't know if Middle Tennessee had all the applicants for 3 years and then none. Can't see that. I think what you can see is that, yeah, you can't see the actual numbers. Maybe this is, well, I guess it couldn't be 3 applicants. So I guess 6 would probably be the lowest number it could be. Maybe this is 6 applicants, in which case, why am I doing this, right? Seeing proportions is important. Ironically, and to my point earlier, this is the one my board of directors likes the best, this view of the applicants. So sometimes making a chart that people know they're going to be able to understand can be important. So making a chart that speaks to your audience can be a big deal. This one's a little bit hard to see, and not for those who are colorblind, just because it's very small. This is a data visualization vocabulary. Again, you can Google any of these online. I love this. I dearly love trying to quantify things that are difficult to quantify and then trying to choose the right way to display those things to see what I want to see. I think it's fascinating that there are so many methods to display data out there and that we limit ourselves over and over and over again to bar charts and pie charts. To be fair, though, I can do those in Excel. I'm not cool like most of you who can program in Minitab. But as a fun exercise, if you have a problem that you're creating a data set for, perhaps before you format the data, go see if there's a better or even just different way that you could do it, keeping in mind who your audience is and what's going to speak to them. Does anybody have a favorite one of these or one they've started using recently that you'd like to suggest or throw out there? My daughter's taking algebra this year and they're learning scatter plots, and I'm so happy. All right. So the part of the decision-making process we left out is everything else that needs to happen, which would be we weigh the evidence that we've created. We identify alternative choices or identify which one's the best. We choose an option. We implement whatever our decision is. And then we have some sort of data on the back end to help us evaluate if we made the correct decision. I'm not going to talk about any of that tonight, partially because I want to be sure and leave time for my friend Kelly, but mostly because I hope you can see if you frame the correct question correctly and gather the data accurately, the rest of this is going to jump off the page at you. The evidence that you're weighing, if it's the right evidence, is going to tell you which option to choose, or if you have no good options. And then implementing's a mess of its own that we'll have to have a different speaker on another night, Arvid, I think. So in conclusion, in application, when you go back to your day jobs and you do this, everyone on this call is probably better at data than everyone else that you encounter. So knowing that, what are our responsibilities as quality practitioners? Number one, we got to help people fight bias. It is our responsibility to call out times when data and information may be appropriate to use. And instead, we've got a manager or a leader that wants to make a decision based on a gut feel. A little funny cartoon here. We've got a doctor and a patient, and the doctor says, of course, this could be confirmation bias from me wanting you to get sick. Call out those situations when you see them, right? Application or takeaway number two is asking the right question is half the battle. And I think the reason that organizations struggle so much with management by fact and database decision-making is because we all want to jump into the middle of the decision-making process. Sometimes we skip the part where we get data completely, but even when we remember to go get data, we go get the data we already have, which may not be set up to answer our question at all, may not be relevant. You may have just given yourself a confirmation bias problem. So my cartoon for that, we've got a little kid who says, I would do better if she would ask questions that more closely match my answers. And then your final takeaway of the night, a picture can be worth 1,000 words. A chart is not merited in every situation. Also, not all of your audience are prepared to understand very complicated charts. But if it's the right chart at the right time, which can be the tried and true pie chart, pie I ate versus pie I plan to eat, sometimes a picture can help people see the decision in the numbers that maybe you've already seen or have a tool to help break those numbers down, but they don't. Are there any questions for me?
I'm going to stop the recording so that people can ask questions if they want. I'm stopping it now.